Alright, let's sew our side seams. So our side seams are just going to be a French seam. So start off putting wrong sides together, as you see here. And we have a 3/4 inch seam allowance. So just like we did on all our other French seams, we're going to start by stitching at a 1/2 inch. So again, side seams are going to be French seamed to finish them. And they're 3/4 inch seam allowances. And we'll start by stitching them at a 1/2 inch. Okay, now that you've stitched wrong sides together, trim it back to 1/8 of an inch. Remember that our French seaming is going to be finished at a 1/4 of an inch, so we need to trim it down to 1/8 so that that raw edge will not come through the finished side of the garment. Now it's been trimmed down to 1/8. Press that seam allowance to one side. Okay. There's no rule like on a dart where you have to press it towards the center or anything. Typically what I do is I press it towards the back. Now that the seam has been pressed to one side, take your garment and put right sides together and then fold your seam in half like I'm doing here, bringing the seam right out to the edge. Because now what we'll do is we're going to press the seam flat. And this makes it much easier to do this second row of stitching to finish the French seam. So press it flat all the way from one side to the other. And again, make sure that the seam is coming out to the edge. Okay, now that we've pressed it flat, let's go ahead and stitch it. And this time we're doing a 1/4 of an inch. All right, so your seam allowance is a 1/4 of an inch. Remember, we had a 3/4 inch seam allowance that we had to eat up. So our first row we did a 1/2 inch. That's leaves a 1/4 left. And so this time stitching, we're doing that last 1/4. And make sure you do this on both seams. And typically, though it's not shown in the video here, I tend to stitch both seams at the same time. So when I did my first rows, when I put wrong sides together, I did a 1/2 inch on one side and a 1/2 inch on the other side. And then I trimmed them both, and then I pressed them both, and then I'm stitching them at the 1/4 side. Okay, now it's been stitched. Press it flat first, set in those stitches, get rid of any puckers or anything. And then open the seam back up and press it to one side. Again, there's no rule which way to press your French seam. I tend to press mine towards the back, but that's entirely up to you which way you want to press it. Just make sure you're consistent. So if you press it towards the back on your left side, make sure you press it towards the back on the right side as well. Okay, now that our side seams have been sewn, we're going to pin in place the collar, or excuse me, the yoke facing. All right. So I'm just going to lay out the blouse real quick so you can see what it looks like. There it is, side seams sewn. So now let's pin in our yoke facing. Now you'll see me just pin it in. All right. I suggest after you finish pinning it in, you baste it in. And so make sure all the yoke facing seam allowances are pressed in towards the yoke. And we're going to pin it at the shoulder. Okay, so line it up with your armhole. There's my blouse. Line it up with the armhole. And then pin it in place. Okay. So again, I'm going to pin these in place. I'm not going to baste mine. But I suggest that everybody do a running basting stitch once they've pinned it in place. And then you can take those pins out and it'll be easier to work on your blouse. And that basting stitch will hold it in place. Okay, so you're going to pin your shoulder seams. All right, so make sure all your seam allowance is facing in towards the facings, because this is how we're clean finishing those seam allowances, by encasing them in between the bodice, the blouse facing, and the yoke facing. All right, so I did both shoulders, and now I'm going to do the bottom. And when you do your running basting stitch, just do it basically right through your, right at the edge there, through the seam allowances, all layers. And that will hold it in place until we're ready to hand tack it closed. Okay. The hand stitching will be the last thing we do. One of the last things we do on this garment. So just pin it in place from armhole to armhole along the bottom, and make sure it's not puckering or too big or anything. And then go ahead and baste it. All right. And once you're done with that, we're ready to go on to the blouse hem.